Hello, my friends. Welcome back to another episode of Perspectives on Life with Old Dr. D. Today, I'm going to share my perspectives on trauma and grief, how they inform one another, how they relate to one another, and some ideas what we can do in the face of them, especially when we see those we care about suffering. So, to define the concept of grief. When you read the various research articles out on grief, grief is a response to loss or anticipated loss. Loss is produced by an event perceived to be negative to varying degrees by individuals involved and has the potential to trigger long-term changes in a person's cognition and relationships. This is from the work of Corliss, for example. Now, there are several things to unpack there. Grief is a response to loss or anticipated loss, and that it varies by degrees. So oftentimes when we think of grief, we think of the grief of losing a loved one, as well we should. And there are loved ones that we lose, and the grief of that forever and indelibly marks us. In other cases, the loss can be expected, and in some cases even embraced. Likewise with anticipatory grief, when we get bad news about our own health or the health of a loved one, then we can grieve and we can feel the sadness and weight of the possibility of that loss moving ahead. One of the things that I would like to highlight while we're here is that with anticipatory grief, that is still loss, because what one has lost is their sense of security that everything's okay, that everything will be lasting, if not permanent. And when we receive the potential for bad news, then it is this harsh reminder, and what we lose is that everything was okay. For example, a couple of weeks ago, I received a message from a dear friend that the doctor believed she may have leukemia. And although I'm old enough and wise enough to know that all relationships are temporary, all of us will die, I get to rest on the assumption that we'll be okay. And that was a wake-up call, and what I lost is that my friend is okay, that we'll get to be friends for a long period of time. Now imagine the relief I felt when just this last week I got to be in the room with her when she talked to the doctor, and she was assured that it's not leukemia. The grief that I felt during the period of time between her initial provisional diagnosis and the actual diagnosis does not go away. Now I get to be mindful of this particular friend, because this was a moment of awareness of how easily this relationship could be lost. So grief in actual, by varying degrees, loved ones that are elderly and have suffered, and so when they finally pass, we feel that mixture of relief and grief, all the way to intense, sudden, unexpected tearing away of someone who died far too young. Likewise with anticipatory grief, it can be very mild, the potential end of an acquaintance, to severe, the loss of our own health, or the loss of a loved one. So as you know, if you've watched episodes of this channel, my background is in the philosophy of phenomenology, Buddhist phenomenology, Christian phenomenology, hermeneutic phenomenology. And so taking up grief from a phenomenological stance, the expression of grief through verbal and nonverbal means does vary across cultures and individuals. And to understand the power of grief, it also helps to understand the power of trauma, because those, when we look deeply and we think deeply, have a fair bit in common. So when we look at the Center for Healthcare Strategies definition, our colleagues there say trauma is a pervasive problem. It results from exposure to an incident or series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, and even spiritual well-being. So looking at this a little more philosophically, trauma entails a significant reversive change to our being in the world. In essence, after a traumatic event, our sense of the world shifts. The world changes. In fact, those of you who have suffered from trauma know what I mean. You wonder how it is that other people can go through their lives so easily, so naively, blissfully unaware of the way the world really is. That when we experience trauma, we experience the world in a new way, and therefore it is our world that is changed. Oftentimes we locate the change inside of us. Another way of thinking about this is, yes, our knowledge has changed, but so too has our world. We are beings in the world, and it is a part of us, and we are a part of it. So as the world changes, so do we, and as we change, so too does our world. Think of how it is that your world is different as an adult compared to how it was as a child. The world and your participation in it has changed. Likewise, when we suffer from a terrible trauma, imagine a loved one going through a car accident, and the way in which now the simple act of driving a car has changed for them, that they are now aware of things in the world that they were not necessarily aware of before. As a man of my size and my disposition and demeanor, I have never feared walking across a dark parking lot late at night. But when I hear stories from friends and family and clients about the violence that they had suffered in a similar situation, their world is substantially different. Their world of dark parking lots is now fraught with peril and fear, whereas for me, it is just something to navigate on my way to the car after work. So trauma changes our world. Philosopher Marion, Claude Romano, for example, his student, I think, talk about the event, and they capitalize the E in event. Events are those times in the world when our world changes for us. When you think of those experiences you've had in life, when the world has presented itself to you in a particular way, where the world is now a different world than it was before. These can be beautiful events when you experience unconditional love for the first time and you realize that the world and those within it can be loving, and it can also be terrible when you realize the world can be cruel or indifferent. Looking into the eyes of my beloved many, many years ago when we first started dating, and seeing reflected in her gaze the best person that I could possibly be, the person that she saw me to be, changed my world, or attuned me to the world differently. Likewise, holding a loved one in my arms as he died, changed my world, or better yet, helped me become better aware of a world that entails loss. So trauma entails these significant changes in the world. The way in which these events, to use the philosophical term, make us mindful and throw the world up to us so that we can never look away from it again. Our world has changed. So this presentation was written and inspired by a colleague of mine who asked, what do we tell people in the town of Enoch, Utah, after a murder and suicide that involved an entire family in that small town? What do we say? My very humble answer, having experienced significant grief in my life, is sometimes there's nothing to say. There are some events you cannot shift back. You cannot take a world that has been tilted on its axis and to shift it upright again, because for those of us that have experienced the tilting of the world is forever tilted, and to try to straighten it out again would do great violence. It would feel like denial, a lie, or betrayal. One thing, though, I've come to know is relating to those suffering the tearing away, traumatic grief, when the trauma they've experienced, the event in their world, entails a great deal of loss. That the connection, our just being there with them and for them, can make that seismic shift more survivable. Around the same time that I learned of the murder and suicide of this family in Enoch, I was talking to a colleague of mine who had walked in on their spouse in flagrante in the midst of an affair. Their entire life upended. All of their assumptions, what it means to love and to be in a committed relationship, all of that suddenly burned to the ground in a flash of the fire of betrayal. The entire world for them is now different. It is a world now of being single when they presumed that they would be married forever. A world where partners can cheat. A world where nothing is certain. So I'm asked from time to time, "Old Dr. D, what do we do in the face of such sorrow? What do we do in the face of such suffering?" And my humble answer is, we do what very little we can. I would also like to share, again humbly, that lots of little efforts often vastly outweighs the occasional big efforts. That if we are all kinder and patient in the face of such traumas and such griefs, that no one of us has to carry the Herculean task of supporting someone in the face of it. So I was really struck watching the Hobbit movie. Walsh and Boylan were the writers. This is not actually in the book, I don't think. It's this lovely quote. "Some believe it is only great power that can hold evil in check, but that is not what I have found. It is the small, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keep the darkness at bay, small acts of kindness and love. The world, as you all know, can be a very dark place. And if all of us, ordinary folks, engage in small, everyday deeds of kindness, then maybe we can keep the darkness at bay for one another. Or at least sometimes just be a flickering candle in the darkness as we encounter our own suffering or the suffering of others." So as I go through this particular set of ideas on trauma and grief, I'm going to wax poetic a fair bit. Words are very small boxes for the meaning that transcends them. And I hope that by stacking the boxes just so, I might approximate the depth of feeling, even inadequately, even if incompletely. And so we'll share notions of poetry from ourselves and throughout time. And hopefully this will resonate with you. And hopefully this will be a little flickering candle in the darkness of your world. Or if you know somebody who is suffering, maybe a little flicker of light in theirs. So this written by Hemingway. "The world breaks everyone, and after many are strong at the broken places. But those that it does not break, it kills. It kills the very brave, the very good, the very gentle impartially. And if you are none of these things, you can be sure it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry. The world breaks everyone, and afterwards many are strong in the broken places. But those that it will not break, it kills." Every year for 22 years, we celebrate the end of Halloween as enthusiastically as the beginning, but the end of Halloween we celebrate with what we call a pumpkin bash, where everybody brings their now moldering jack-o'-lanterns and softening pumpkins to my house, and we pull out, the baseball bats and maces and hammers and things, and we splatter the pumpkins in the backyard. It's called the pumpkin bash. And there on the table, amidst the various weapons of melee, was a box, a white box with a green sticker on it with Japanese writing. And I looked at my friend Sam and I went, "What's this?" And he says, "Oh, that's our Kintsugi kit." And I went, "Oh." And so he taught me that there is a Japanese art form that when a piece of pottery breaks, they use golden enamel to put the pottery back together again, such that when you see the pot, the cup, the bowl, where it has been broken is now clearly outlined with this gold epoxy, and it makes for a startlingly beautiful aesthetic moment. And I realized that's much like our hearts, that when the world hits us with its hammer, or when our heart plunges out of our chest to the ground and shatters, and when we are slowly glued back together by ourselves and are trusting to love the world even though it's risky, we become strong in our broken places. It is a tragedy of loving that when we are brokenhearted, and we are brokenhearted in the face of love, that by loving, we become strong in our broken places. A few years ago, I was reading a book by Epstein, psychiatrist. And in this particular book, he says, those not suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder are suffering from pre-traumatic stress disorder, highlighting that this life is very, very difficult. And those who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder have experienced the world in its uglier and cruel places. And those that have not yet may just come to do so. So therefore, sometimes their denial, naivety, is their manifestation of suffering from pre-traumatic stress disorder. When you have experienced significant loss, when you have experienced significant trauma, and there are those who come up to comfort you and they say naive things, that denial is their pre-traumatic stress disorder, and it's okay. You get to love them in the face of their naivety, in the face of their denial. There is something else, though, that I would like you to wrestle with me. Not wrestle me, but wrestle with the idea. That is, there is a universality to suffering, and it makes the process relatable. When we lost one of our children, other people would come up to us and say, "I can't even imagine." And they would cry, and they would hold members of my family or myself. And I would hold them and cry too, because they can't imagine it. They really can. And I'm grateful that for some of them, it's only imagination. However, it is imagination born of suffering in the world, such that they can picture the cracks on their own heart or the shattering thereof in the face of all of this pain. And they can't imagine it. And that's where their compassionate hugs come from. They may not know the particulars of exactly which corners of their heart will break off. Oftentimes, though, I felt enough brokenheartedness to get a little bit of what it's like. So even though some are in denial, and some say things that are maybe unintentionally a little hurtful, that's just pre-traumatic stress disorder. Usually people are aware that the suffering transcends words. We broke this longer video down into multiple segments for ease and convenience of listening. So thank you for joining me on part 1 of the Poetics of Trauma and Grief.